Welcome to Legends of Humanity, the global history channel where we bring to life the journeys of extraordinary individuals who changed the world. In today's episode, we step into the life of Nelson Mandela, the hero of South Africa, a living symbol of forgiveness, justice, and the unbreakable pursuit of freedom. From a young boy in a rural Xhosa village to a prisoner held for 27 years on Robben Island, and finally the first democratically elected president of South Africa, Mandela not only liberated a nation, but also inspired humanity with the power of compassion and reconciliation. On a quiet winter morning of July 18, 1918, in the humble village of Mvezo along the Mbasha River, a child was born into the soil of South Africa who would someday move the conscience of the world. He was given the name Rolihlahla, a Xhosa word that loosely means pulling the branch of a tree. Yet within the culture, the name held another meaning, troublemaker. It was a name both affectionate and prophetic. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakanyiswa, was a chief in the Thembu people's royal line and a trusted counselor to their king. Though not in line for the throne, Gadla carried the weight of authority and tradition. He had 4 wives, and Rolihlahla was born to the third Nonkafi Nosekenia gentlewoman of steady grace. The family belonged to the Madiba clan, a name that would one day be spoken with reverence across nations. Rolihlahla's early years in Mvezo were brief but formative. When he was still a child, his father defied a colonial magistrate, refusing to bow before a system he believed unjust. The consequence was swift. He was stripped of his title and forced to move his family to the village of Kunu. There, among rolling hills and thatched huts, the child known as Rolihlahla would grow in body and spirit. Kunu was a place of simplicity and rhythm. Boys herded cattle barefoot beneath the sun, playing stick-fighting games that mirrored the real battles of life. It was here that young Rolihlahla learned about courage not from books, but from scraped knees, broken sticks, and the laughter of competition. He was a child among many, yet carried himself with an unusual, quiet thoughtfulness, absorbing everything. At the age of 7, his life took a new turn. He was sent to a local Methodist school, where the teacher, following colonial custom, gave him a Christian name Nelson. No one asked his opinion. No ceremony marked the moment. Yet from then on, the boy had 2 names, one given by his people, one assigned by history. And so began the strange duality that would mark his life, one foot in his ancestral roots, the other in the world of imposed order. Tragedy struck when he was just 9. His father, his first symbol of strength and dignity, died after a long illness. For a boy, it was a shattering loss. But fate had another chapter waiting. Before his death, Gadla had entrusted his son's future to the acting regent of the Thembu people Jongintaba Dalindibo. True to his word, the regent welcomed Nelson into his household at the royal residence of Mokhekezweni. From that moment, the child who once herded cattle in Kunu now walked among the corridors of leadership. At Mkhekezweni, Nelson lived alongside the regent's children and was treated as a son. He sat silently during tribal councils, listening as elders debated, argued, and resolved disputes. The young boy learned that leadership was not lauded, was patient, it listened, and it served. There were stories told by firelight, parables passed down by generations. He absorbed them all, the heroism of warriors, the wisdom of chiefs, the sorrow of lost battles. But above all, he learned that dignity was not given by birth or position. It was earned through service, humility, and sacrifice. Even as he played and studied like any child, there was something in him already setting roots deeper than most. A quiet resolve, a hunger to understand, a fire not yet named. In the stillness of Mokhekezweni, far from the roar of politics and protest, a leader was taking shape not yet in name, not yet in title, but in spirit. Rolihlahla Nelson was growing into more than a boy. He was becoming a voice waiting to be heard, a force waiting to rise. In 1939, Nelson Mandela set foot in a place that, for many in his generation, represented hope against impossible odds. The University of Fort Hare. Tucked away in the rural Eastern Cape, Fort Hare was the only residential institution for Black Africans in all of South Africa. It was no ordinary school. It was a crucible for young minds who dreamed of shaping a different world, even when they were told they had no place in it. Mandela, then just 21, arrived with the quiet determination of someone carrying more than just textbooks in his satchel. He was the son of a chief, raised under royal tradition, but he walked into the university gates as an equal among equals young men from across the continent, all burning with questions that no colonial syllabus could fully answer. He enrolled for a Bachelor of Arts, diving into subjects like English, anthropology, and Roman Dutch law. But Fort Hare offered more than academics. It was a meeting ground of ideas, a place where cultures clashed and identities awakened. In dusty lecture halls and whispered dormitory debates, Mandela began to understand the shape of his own voice. He wasn't a natural rebel yet. Something inside him stirred at the sight of injustice. When the Student Representative Council, SRC, to which he had been elected, called for a boycott over poor food and undemocratic policies, Mandela refused to comply with orders to withdraw his support. He would not be silenced. He resigned from the SRC in protest, defying the university's expectations. The administration demanded obedience. Instead, Mandela chose integrity and was expelled. Returning home to the Great Place at Mkhitaryan, Mandela faced yet another confrontation, this time from tradition itself. The regent Jongen Taba Dalindibo, who had raised him as a son, had arranged a marriage for him. It was expected, honorable, and final. But Mandela, at a crossroads between obligation and freedom, chose neither. He ran. He arrived in Johannesburg in 1941 with no money, no degree, and no clear path forward. The city, loud and unyielding, was a world away from the quiet hills of Kunu or the structured traditions of Mkhitaryan. He worked briefly as a night watchman and a Minian anonymous figure among thousands of other Black men laboring under apartheid's crushing heel. It was here, in the soot and concrete of urban life, that Mandela began to truly see the system he was up against. Fate intervened again when he met Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent, with revolutionary fire in his eyes. Through Sisulu, Mandela found work at a liberal white law firm and enrolled in a correspondence course at the University of South Africa. More importantly, he found something else, a direction. The city was a harsh teacher, but its lessons were unignorable. The humiliations of past laws, segregated buses, and daily indignities sparked a clarity in him. Injustice was not only a political reality, it was a personal offense. In the narrow backrooms of law offices and the crowded meetings of emerging activists, Mandela's dream of becoming a lawyer began to transform. He was no longer just seeking personal advancement. He was beginning to imagine justice, not as theory, but as necessity. He joined the African National Congress in 1943, not with the roar of a revolution, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had seen enough to know he could no longer remain on the sidelines. He had once dreamed of being a leader in the traditional Sensia, counselor to kings, a guide to his people through wisdom and ceremony. But the world was changing, and so was he. Johannesburg had stripped away the old titles, the inherited paths, and left him with something far more powerful: conviction. This chapter of Mandela's life was not about triumph or titles. It was about loss, questioning, and defiance. It was the slow burning of certainty into purpose. The expelled student had arrived in the furnace of history and begun to forge the steel of a freedom fighter. Johannesburg in the 1940s was a city dressed in ambition but cloaked in inequality. For young Black South Africans, its glittering skyline offered little more than shadow. The streets hummed with energy buses rattled down segregated lanes, shop fronts displayed whites-only signs like silent warnings, and police boots echoed off the pavements with a rhythm of fear. This was the landscape in which Nelson Mandela began his career in law. He had no inherited wealth, no patronage. He worked by day as an article clerk in a white-run law firm, and by night studied law through correspondence. The nights were long, the textbooks dense, and the days unforgiving. But Mandela pressed on not just out of ambition, but because law had always been, in theory, the language of justice. and he still believed in its promise. In 1942, he completed his BA degree and enrolled at the University of Witwatersrand to study law. It was a predominantly white institution, and the environment was hostile. Few of his classmates treated him as an equal. He endured the slights in silence, sharpening not only his mind, but his resolve. It was there that he began to understand how the law, in the wrong hands, could become a weapon known that reinforced injustice instead of defeating it. By 1952, Mandela had become one of the first Black Africans in South Africa to open a law firm. Alongside Oliver Tambo, he co-founded Mandela Tambo, a modest practice in downtown Johannesburg. To the apartheid government, it was just another Black business. But to the people it served, the poor, the voiceless, the crushed, it was a beacon of dignity. Their office was small, often overcrowded, its walls lined with case files and hope. Long queues of clients waited outside, domestic workers wrongfully accused, laborers fined for passbook violations, families evicted without cause. The law, meant to serve, had become a machinery of cruelty. Mandela didn't just defend these clients, she listened to them, stood with them, and, in the process, began to turn law into protest. Each case became a lesson, each verdict a warning. The courts were no neutral ground. They were extensions of apartheid's reach. The more Mandela studied statutes and precedent, the more he saw how every clause, every ordinance, had been bent to preserve white supremacy. He had once believed in the fairness of the system. That belief was dying, slowly, with every unjust ruling he witnessed. This disillusionment didn't break him, it transformed him. In the courtrooms, he wore suits and cited precedents. Outside them, he marched. His legal training sharpened his activism. He knew the language of the oppressor and used it against them. He wrote speeches with the structure of arguments, wove law into resistance, and learned to battle both in the streets and within the walls of Parliament's laws. It was during these years that Mandela's political identity truly began to crystallize. He had joined the African National Congress, but now he pushed for a more militant strategy. He was no longer content to file appeals. He wanted to challenge the system at its roots. Alongside young visionaries like Walter Sisulu and Anton Lembede, he helped form the ANC Youth League, an organization determined to shake off passivity and demand real, radical change. To some, Mandela was still a lawyer, but to many, he was becoming something else entirely, a symbol, a man who walked between two worlds, the law and the people, and who refused to surrender to either. In the glare of a broken system, he had chosen to stand, not just as a defender of rights, but as a challenger of the very law he once sought to uphold. He had stepped onto the line of fire armed, not with weapons, but with words, with courage, and with an unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for, even if it meant breaking the very rules he had studied so hard to master. By the late 1940s, Nelson Mandela had become many things: a young lawyer, a husband, a father, a man respected in courtrooms and whispered about in the streets. But beneath the surface of respectability, a transformation was underway. He no longer believed change could come through legal arguments alone. The law, as he saw it, had been written to protect a system of racial tyranny. And so Mandela chose to walk away from safety and towards struggle. He had joined the African National Congress in 1943. But in those early days, the ANC was still a cautious organization, respectful, measured, largely led by older elites. They passed resolutions, they wrote petitions, but the world was changing, and the people were growing restless. In townships and villages, Black South Africans were tired of waiting for permission to be treated like human beings. Mandela, along with a group of young radicals including Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, formed the ANC Youth League. Their message was clear: passive resistance was not enough. They called for mass action boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience. They believed in African nationalism and self-liberation, and they were no longer willing to ask politely for what had already been stolen from them. In 1952, Mandela helped launch the Defiance Campania coordinated movement of resistance against apartheid laws. Thousands of volunteers purposefully broke segregation rules, entering whites-only areas, refusing to carry passbooks, sitting in forbidden spaces. It was not violence, but it was confrontation. Mandela traveled the country, recruiting volunteers, giving speeches, organizing cells of defiers. He became the national face of disobedience. The government responded with arrests, threats, and new laws designed to silence the rising tide. Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 9 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. But he was undeterred. In the heat of repression, his voice grew stronger. He was banned from public gatherings, prohibited from leaving Johannesburg, forbidden to be quoted in newspapers. The state tried to erase him, but the people had already begun to remember his name. He operated underground, moving from house to house, changing routes, meeting in secrecy. His days as a young professional in press suits were fading into a life of constant vigilance. The ANC grew more organized. So did the police. In 1955, he played a key role in the Congress of the People, gathering of activists, trade unions, and liberation groups from across South Africa. There they drafted the Freedom Charter, a radical document that declared, among other things, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. It was a revolutionary idea, and a dangerous one. By now, Mandela was living with a target on his back. He was a man watched, a man hunted. The police raided his home, followed his movements, and harassed his family. The life of a public dissenter was no longer abstracted, meant real danger, real loss. He could have stepped back. He could have returned to his law practice, to his children, to the comfort of a quieter life. But he didn't. He chose the dangerous road, fully aware of where it might lead, because Mandela understood that silence was no longer an option. Every law he had studied, every injustice he had defended against, had led him to this point not to observe history, but to shape it. And so he walked forward into protests, into handcuffs, into courtrooms, into the shadows of a government that feared what he represented. A black man, unafraid, a voice that would not be silenced. A leader beginning to rise from the fire of resistance. By the early 1960s, Nelson Mandela had exhausted every peaceful avenue he had once believed in. Petitions had been ignored. Peaceful protests had been met with violence. Lawsuits had been crushed beneath the weight of courts that answered only to power. South Africa was not listening. Its leaders had chosen bullets over ballots. And Mandela, a man of speeches and suitswas, now a man with no road left to walk but the most dangerous one of all. The turning point came after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. 69 unarmed protesters, many shot in the back, were gunned down by police for refusing to carry passbooks. The state declared a state of emergency and banned the African National Congress. With the peaceful path obliterated, Mandela and his closest comrades were forced to ask, what do you do when your government makes nonviolence a crime? The answer, for Mandela, came with enormous moral weight. It was not a decision made in anger, but in necessity. In 1961, he co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, a militant wing of the ANC. Its goal was not to kill, but to disrupt. Sabotage, not terror. Power plants, railway lines, communication hubs, these were the targets. Each act was designed to damage the machinery of apartheid, not its human agents. Mandela knew what this meant. He would go underground, change locations, live in disguise. He traveled across Africa and into London, seeking support for the armed struggle, meeting leaders, training in guerrilla tactics. He became known as the Black Pimpernel, slipping through the grasp of a regime that wanted him silenced. But the regime was closing in. In 1962, Mandela was arrested after returning to South Africa. He was charged not for bombs or sabotage, but for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But that was only the beginning. During his imprisonment, police raided a secret hideout in Rivonia, just outside Johannesburg. There, they uncovered documents linking Mandela and other ANC leaders to acts of sabotage and revolutionary planning. It was enough for the government to pursue the most serious charges imaginable: treason. The Rivonia trial began in 1963. Mandela and his co-defendants were tried for plotting the violent overthrow of the state. The penalty was death, and then, standing in the courtroom, facing the very system he had dedicated his life to dismantling, Mandela spoke words that would echo through history. He did not beg. He did not plead. He defended his cause with the calm courage of a man already free in spirit. "I have fought against white domination," he said, "and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Those who heard it, whether in that courtroom or across the seas, understood that this was not just a man on trial. It was a nation's conscience speaking through him. In June 1964, the verdict came: guilty. Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment. The world gasped. The doors of Robben Island slammed shut behind him, but the dangerous road he had chosen did not end in that courtroom. It only changed direction. He walked into a prison cell not as a broken man, but as a soldier of justice. And though the state believed it had buried him, it had, in fact, only planted him deeper into the hearts of millions who now saw his struggle as their own. There was no turning back. The boat to Robben Island cut across the cold Atlantic like a blade. Nelson Mandela, now a prisoner with a number for a name 466, 64. The 466th prisoner of the year 1000. 964 stood silently on the deck, chained, watching the outline of the island grow nearer. It was a barren, wind-beaten scrap of rock, but it would become the crucible where his soul was tested, broken, and reforged over nearly 3 decades. Robben Island was more than a prison. It was a calculated machine of degradation. Mandela and his fellow political prisoners were locked away from the world, far from their families, from the streets they had marched, from the nation they sought to free. They were housed in a separate section, isolated from common criminals, but treated with even greater cruelty. Mandela was assigned to a small, damp cell barely long enough for a man to lie down. There was no bed, only a straw mat. The light never dimmed. The food was meager and deliberately inferior. Each morning, the guards barked orders. Prisoners were marched out to break rocks in the limestone quarry under a punishing sun that burned skin and blinded eyes. Dust clung to their lungs. Their hands bled. Their dignity was under siege. Letters were rare censored, delayed, or denied altogether. Visits from family were limited to 30 minutes once every 6 months. And even then, Mandela often found his loved ones blocked by bureaucratic excuses. His children grew up without him. His mother passed away. His eldest son died in a car crash. Mandela was denied permission to attend either funeral. Grief came without goodbye. But Mandela refused to let prison define him. He exercised daily in his cramped cell. He studied, read, and encouraged others to do the same. Over time, he transformed Robben Island into something unexpected: a school of resistance. Prisoners organized study groups. They debated philosophy, politics, poetry. They taught each other languages. In silence, through solidarity, they reclaimed their minds. The guards could beat them, they could isolate them, but they could not control how they thought. Mandela, calm and composed even in shackles, became the undisputed leader of the prison population. He spoke not with anger but with quiet conviction. When prisoners were mistreated, he filed complaints. When tempers rose, he calmed them. His authority did not come from force but from moral clarity. He fought for the right to wear long pants symbolic of manhood. He fought for newspapers, for access to books, for the right to education. Small victories, each one carved from the stone of cruelty with patience and resolve. Over time, even some of the wardens grew to respect him. They began to call him Tata, Father. He never saw himself as a saint. He had moments of rage, despair, longing, but he refused to let hatred consume him. In one of his most private reflections, he wrote, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. As the years passed, 5, 10, 15 South Africa changed. Outside the prison walls, the fires of resistance burned brighter. The Soweto uprising, the rise of black consciousness, the death of Steve Biko, the world was watching. Mandela had become more than a man. He was now a symbol, a myth, a whisper of hope. And yet, he remained a prisoner. Days blurred into months. Years fell like leaves. Still, he waited. Still, he endured. 20 years in, he was moved to Pollsmoor prison, closer to the mainland, but still behind bars. Later, to Victor Verster prison. The walls changed, but the struggle did not. Mandela continued negotiations with the government from inside, always on his terms, never for his own release, only for the liberation of his people. In total, he spent 27 years behind bars, 27 birthdays in captivity, 27 years of missed hugs, empty chairs, unanswered prayers. But he emerged, not bitter, not broken. He emerged, somehow whole. For in the darkest place, under the harshest light, he had discovered something the regime could never steal: the power of endurance and the dignity of choosing grace over vengeance. On the morning of February 11, 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison creaked open. The world held its breath. A tall man in a dark suit, his hair graying but his spine unbent, stepped out. By his side walked his wife, Winnie. Cameras clicked, voices trembled, and hearts across continents surged with hope. After 27 years behind bars, Nelson Mandela was free. He did not run. He did not raise his fists. He walked calmly, steadily, as if time had not passed at all. And yet, everything had changed. Outside the prison walls, South Africa was on the edge of a knife. The country had been ravaged by decades of apartheid, choked by sanctions, shaken by internal unrest. Protesters flooded the streets, police fired tear gas, the nation teetered between chaos and transformation. And now, returning from the shadows, was a man who had become its most potent symbol of resistance and its most unlikely source of healing. The years had not dulled Mandela's conviction, but they had deepened his wisdom. Many expected anger. Some hoped for retribution. But Mandela offered neither. In his first speech after walking free, he declared, "I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people. Your tireless and heroic sacrifices have made it possible for me to be here today." He spoke not of vengeance, but of peace. Not of war, but of unity. Mandela resumed leadership of the African National Congress, now unbanned after decades in the shadows. The ANC was no longer just a liberation movement, it was the guiding force toward a democratic future. Negotiations with the apartheid government began almost immediately. Mandela met with F.W. de Klerk, the white president who had authorized his release. They were political opposites, but Mandela insisted on dialogue. It was not easy. Blood still ran in the streets. Right-wing groups resisted change. Some within Mandela's own movement questioned his strategy of reconciliation. After so much suffering, how could he preach forgiveness? But Mandela knew, if the nation gave in to revenge, it would drown in the same hatred it sought to escape. Courage, he said, is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. And so, with infinite patience, he guided the country through its most delicate season, neither fully winter nor quite yet spring. He traveled the world, now as a free man. Heads of state lined up to shake his hand. Crowds wept at his presence, but Mandela remained grounded. He returned to his humble home in Soweto. He greeted old neighbors. He held the hands of mothers whose sons had died in protests. He was not interested in glory, only in justice. The process of negotiating a new constitution began. A transitional government took shape. The walls of apartheid, once immovable, began to crack not from explosions, but from words, signatures, and the moral force of Mandela's presence. In the heart of this fragile hope, Mandela kept his promise. He called for multiracial democracy. He insisted that both black and white South Africans had a future in the same country. He rejected the idea of replacing one tyranny with another. He did not want to reverse oppression. He wanted to end it. There were setbacks. Talks collapsed, then resumed. Violence flared, then calmed. But slowly, like the first green shoots after a long drought, something new began to grow. The man who had once been branded a terrorist now spoke in parliaments. The prisoner of Robben Island now sat at negotiating tables. And across the nation, people began to believe in the impossible. Mandela's freedom was not just a moment, it was a movement. It told the world that dignity could survive even in a prison cell, that peace could rise from pain, that a man could lose 3 decades of his life and still walk into the sunlight carrying hope instead of hatred. It was not yet victory, but it was spring, April 27, 1994. The day South Africa breathed as one for the first time. Across the country, people lined up, black, white, colored, Indian many waiting for hours, some for entire nights, just to cast a vote. For millions, it was their first. For centuries, their voices had been silenced. Now they spoke with ballots. In dusty villages and crowded townships, in glittering cities and farmlands, history was being rewritten peacefully, defiantly, joyfully. The moment had come. South Africa, once a fractured land, was choosing unity. At the center of it all stood Nelson Mandela. At 75, he carried the weight of a nation's hopes and the scars of its past. He did not campaign with vengeance, he offered reconciliation. His message was not take back, but move forward. And the people listened. On May 10, 1994, under the bright sky of Pretoria, Mandela took the oath of office. He became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. In the audience sat his comrades, his jailers, his friends, and former enemies. There were tears, there was silence, there was thunderous applause. In his inaugural address, Mandela's voice rang not with triumph, but with tenderness. He spoke of a rainbow nation, of healing, of shared responsibility. Never, never, and never again, he declared, shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The task before him was enormous. The country was divided not only by race, but by economics, geography, and memory. Townships were still scarred by poverty. Education was unequal. Healthcare, housing, and jobs known were guaranteed. And yet, Mandela refused to govern in bitterness. He brought former enemies into his cabinet. He worked with whites who had once supported apartheid. He insisted South Africa could not be rebuilt by burning down what existed, but by transforming it. One of his most powerful decisions was to support the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Rather than launching witch hunts or tribunals, the commission gave victims and perpetrators alike a chance to speak, confess, forgive. It was not perfect, but it was revolutionary. In stadiums and small churches, across microphones and courtrooms, South Africans listened to the stories they had long buried of torture, of betrayal, of courage. And through tears, they found not revenge but understanding. Mandela set the tone. He visited the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid. He wore the jersey of the national rugby team once, a symbol of white supremacy to unite the nation during the 1995 Rugby World Cup. When South Africa won, he handed the trophy to the white team captain with a smile, wearing that green and gold jersey, and the crowd chanted his name. It was not just symbolic, it was seismic. Mandela governed with humility. He refused a second term. He never enriched himself. He lived modestly, continued to meet with activists, artists, students, diplomats. He encouraged debate. He made space for others to rise. He knew that democracy was not a destination, it was a daily act of faith. During his presidency, he built schools, clinics, homes. The new constitution enshrined human rights, equality, and freedom. The flag changed, the anthem changed, but most importantly, the people began to believe that change was truly possible. Mandela was not naive. He knew healing would take generations. But he had given the country its most precious starting point, a shared identity. South Africa was no longer black or white, rich or poor, captor or captive. It was one nation wounded, but walking together. He had once fought for freedom. Now, as president, he fought for peace. And in doing so, Mandela proved that true leadership is not about power, it is about presence, about walking through a room with open hands, about turning pain into purpose, about lifting a nation not on your shoulders, but with your soul. He had been a prisoner. Now he was president. But in both roles, he had remained the same man, unbreakable in spirit, unwavering in principle, and unshakable in love for his people. When Nelson Mandela left the presidency in 1999, he did so without ceremony or resistance. He had led South Africa through its most fragile hour and guided it into democracy. He could have stayed. The people would have let him. But true to his Wardand, his character, he stepped aside, declaring, "I do not want to be regarded as a messiah, but as a servant of the people." Yet even in retirement, Mandela's light only grew brighter. He was no longer head of state, but he became something far greater, a statesman of the world, a moral compass for humanity. In an age of cynicism, he stood as proof that dignity could survive oppression, that forgiveness could heal even the deepest wounds. With a steady hand and warm eyes, Mandela embarked on a new journey this time, not as a revolutionary or president, but as a symbol of what was possible when bitterness was abandoned for compassion. He founded the Nelson Mandela Foundation, shifting his focus to education, public health, and the promotion of human rights. At a time when HIV/AIDS was ravaging South Africa and met with silence by many in power, Mandela spoke boldly. "We are facing a silent genocide," he warned, urging action, awareness, and empathy. He did not retreat to comfort. He traveled tirelessly meeting children in underfunded schools, embracing AIDS patients in clinics, visiting refugee camps. In every encounter, he brought the same quiet authority, listening before speaking, lifting others with the gravity of his presence. World leaders sought his counsel. Kings, presidents, and prime ministers stood in his shadow, yet Mandela never spoke down to anyone. He joked, he listened, he remembered names. He believed that greatness was not measured by titles, but by kindness. He visited war zones. He met with political rivals. He broke bread with former enemies. His message was always the same: the future depends not on vengeance, but on vision. In the early 2000s, he turned his attention to the next generation. He urged young people to carry the baton forward, to lead from the back and let others believe they are in front. He championed literacy, gender equality, and access to justice. He said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Mandela understood that his life had become legend, but he resisted being placed on a pedestal. He often reminded people, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." He laughed easily, hugged often, and told stories with the warmth of a grandfather. He enjoyed quiet evenings in his Johannesburg home, surrounded by books and memories. He held his great-grandchildren on his lap. He wore colorful shirts. He danced. He lived. In his twilight years, his body began to fail, but his mind remained luminous. Even as he withdrew from public life, the world clung to his example. Streets were named after him. Statues were built, awards created, yet no tribute could match the simple power of his presence. To many, he was Madiba, his clan name. To others, Tata, father. To all, he was a symbol, not of perfection, but of perseverance. Mandela had spent 27 years behind bars, yet emerged with an open heart. He had led a wounded nation, yet refused to rule with fear. He had known sorrow deeper than words, yet chose to build joy. He once said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness behind, I would still be in prison." And because he chose freedom not just for himself, but for all, he taught the world that forgiveness is not weakness, it is the strength that rebuilds nations, the courage that silences hatred, the grace that binds humanity together. He did not just liberate South Africa, he liberated the very idea of what it means to lead with mercy, with humility, and above all, with love. On December 5, 2013, the world stood still. Nelson Mandela, the prisoner who became a president, the warrior who became a healer, the man who refused to hate had passed away peacefully at the age of 95. South Africa mourned. The world wept. From presidents to school children, from remote villages to the halls of the United Nations, one truth echoed louder than the silence he left behind. A giant had walked among us. News of his death spread like a hush through a crowded room. People lit candles on sidewalks. Flags dropped to half-mast. Churches rang their bells. Tribes beat their drums. Mosques and temples whispered prayers. For a man who had always spoken softly, his absence thundered across continents. 10 days of national mourning followed. His body lay in state in Pretoria, and the people came by the thousands, by the millions. They waited in long, snaking lines under the hot sun. Some wept, some sang, some stood in silence. All came to say, thank you. On December 10th, a memorial service was held at FNB Stadium in Johannesburg. It was no ordinary gathering. More than 90 heads of state sat shoulder to shoulder. Barack Obama, Ban Ki-moon, David Cameron, Raul Castro not by politics, but by reverence. Rain fell as they spoke, as if the sky itself had joined the tribute. Mandela's coffin, draped in the South African flag, was flown to his ancestral home in Kunu. There, on a hill overlooking the lands of his childhood, he was buried beside family. The final resting place of a man who had spent most of his life in motion fighting, guiding, building, and yet, Mandela never truly left. He remained in the voices of young leaders quoting his words, in classrooms teaching his story, in courtrooms shaped by the Constitution he helped write, in peace agreements inspired by his patience, in divided lands still searching for a path beyond hatred. His legacy was not built in a single act, but in a lifetime of choices. He chose to forgive when he had every right to rage. He chose to listen when others shouted. He chose to step down when power was his for the keeping. He chose humility over pride, grace over glory, people over politics. He left no gold, no throne, no monument carved in marble. He left something far greater, a roadmap, a belief that courage could be quiet, that justice could be kind, that leadership could look like service. That one life lived fully, truthfully, purposefully could awaken the best in humanity. In South Africa, his birthday, July 18th, now celebrated as Mandela Day, a global call to dedicate time to helping others. His foundation continues his work, fighting for justice, equality, and health. His name adorns schools, hospitals, bridges. His face appears on murals from Soweto to Sao Paulo. But the true monument to Nelson Mandela cannot be built with bricks. It is built every time someone chooses dialogue over violence, dignity over division, peace over revenge. Every time a child believes their voice matters. Every time a prisoner dreams of freedom not just for themselves, but for everyone. Mandela once said, "Death is something inevitable." When a man has done what he considers to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. And so, he rests not in silence, but in legacy. The sun set on his life, but the light he left behind still burned soft, steady, indestructible. Nelson Mandela is no longer among us, but he is forever within us. You've just listened to the incredible journey of Nelson Mandela, the spiritual father of South Africa, and one of the most powerful symbols of modern history. Subscribe to Legends of Humanity to explore the lives of legendary figures from around the globe, from visionary leaders, scientists, philosophers, and artists, to the silent heroes whose stories continue to shape our world. Legends of Humanity, where history becomes timeless inspiration.